Hello, I'm Greg Forster. I'm the Executive Director of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, and I'm in conversation today with Jon Levenson, who is the Albert A. List Professor of Jewish Studies at Harvard Divinity School at Harvard University, and who was a recipient of a 2023 Berry Prize for Distinguished Intellectual Achievement. Jon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Greg.
Jon, tell us about a few of the most important challenges that you see for maintaining high standards in your discipline.
That's a big question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is politicization, by which I mean the reduction of art, religion, literature, philosophy, such classical humanistic fields, to power relations. And the expectation that they will have immediate relevance in the world in which we now live. What that does is it destroys the precious interval of contemplation and exploration that should be the focus of higher education. I think there's a great danger of presentism, of judging the past according to the present, trying to make the past relevant to the present in a cheap, excessively immediate and politicized way. And when that happens, the past in its own voice is muffled. And what we have, in fact, is politics and power relations and nothing more than that. This is a very widespread assumption or presupposition, usually unspoken, often unspoken, among scholars of matters like religion, art, literature, and I think it needs to be combated. I think college in particular should be a time to form one's deepest life commitments or to firm them up, and to do so in an informed way, aware of the alternatives to one's own commitments and respectful of the more serious critiques of them, but committed nonetheless. In other words, it's a kind of contemplative period of life and should not be forced into a mode of activism and commitment. Students will have a lifetime to be active, a lifetime to earn a living. They should be given, ideally, some interval of time to reflect, to explore, to learn new things that don't seem to be immediately relevant.
I think I hear two different lines that you're teasing out here, and you could tell me if I'm right about this. One might be called a reductionism of purpose. So the purpose of studying the things we study is not merely to accomplish some material end in the short term, but we want to study things that are good in themselves, that are worth knowing in themselves, that give us, a deeper sense of who we are as human beings without necessarily having immediate application. And then I also think I hear what might be called a reductionism of explanations, right? An explanatory reductionism, an expectation that nothing happens in the world except political relations. For example, I think I may hear that behind when you said we can't hear the past as it really was if we bring to it this assumption of kind of everything is politics. I don't know. Tell me if I'm on the right track there.
I think you're absolutely on the right track. I think that those two things are points I was making. But also that they're related to each other. That I think the reduction to politics, to identity, to power relations, then occludes the past in its own voice. Of course, we never hear the past perfectly in its own voice. There's no such thing as pure objectivity, but that doesn't mean the quest for objectivity should be abandoned. And so I think, yes, both those themes are there, and both of them are they're related to each other. And I think part of the problem here is that the modern university has a very high evaluation of innovation and discovery at the expense of the appropriation of a classical or foundational past. Students and professors now, I think largely under the influence of the scientific revolution and scientific research, now try to find something new when they really haven't mastered and may not even know about what's old. As we now have scholars who are specialists who've never been generalists. I think this is very destructive to the humanities. Of course, innovation is valuable and people want to learn new material. But the notion that therefore the past, the classical past, the foundational past, the once normative past has been discredited, and only that which applies today, that presentism I mentioned a moment ago, that becomes very, very dangerous to the whole academic enterprise. And the last thing that comes immediately to mind is that students today seem to be increasingly fragile. And I think there's a corollary shift from a corresponding shift from a pedagogical model of the teaching vocation to a kind of mental health model. You got to be careful that everything you say is inoffensive and that no one is challenged in their psyche. But I think some challenging in the psyche is essential to the educational process. And how to deal with it as a mature adult is very, very important. When we shift from the pedagogical model to the mental health model, I think that skill tends to be lost. And this is a very serious problem today. Of course, in the more immediate sense, I could say, just speaking of my own experience, that the upsurge of anti-Semitism on campus and in academia and even in curricular units is very, very problematic, very redolent of some of the worst of modern history. And that I feel I should also mention. But in the more theoretical, abstract level, those 3 or 4 points I already made strike me as the most important.
There may be a relationship in that when you were talking about the mental health model, you seem to be suggesting that an exclusive focus on mental health is actually not necessarily good for mental health because we never develop the skills we need to be healthy people mentally.
That's right. That's exactly right. It holds back the process of maturation and impedes the development of a resilient personality. And without a certain maturation and resilience, I don't think one can really have much of an intellectual life.
And there is a really stark and disturbing relationship between failure to develop these basic skills of resilience and these basic kind of the strength of center in a human being and extreme ideologies, forms of bigotry. We call this behavior deranged for a reason, right? So the rise of anti-Semitism on campus that you mentioned, part of the context for that is that students are not learning how to cope for themselves, how to be resilient. They want enemies. They want, nefarious forces they can blame for their problems. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. I also think that to some extent they're in need of, although you usually don't recognize that they're in need of, some transcendent focus and some larger cause. But the transcendent focus and larger cause that came from traditional religion, from the humanities in an older model, have largely disappeared, at least from their lives. And therefore, the absolutistic judgments and the absolute moralistic judgments and the camaraderie of being in a mob appeals to them. Those things appeal to them. And that also contributes, I think, to that unfortunate atmosphere on campus. I mean, it may not last, we'll see, but I think this is a more serious threat to the educational enterprise than most people recognize.
And a reflection of our problems that these students are steeped in the university, yet have not found a better cause to which to devote themselves. And that actually leads me to my next question. We've been talking for a while now about the mission of the university. What is the purpose of a university? So my next question is, in what ways do you think the public at large has a good understanding of the mission of the university? And in what ways does the public at large have not so good an understanding of the mission of the university?
I think there's a widespread confusion of liberal arts education with vocational school. In other words, the key thing is to acquire serviceable skills as opposed to the full development of the mind and the character. Those things that, as you say, are good in and of themselves. And considering the cost of college today, considering the economic constraints, one can see why there is this pressure from the parents and from the society at large to make education primarily into a kind of vocational school. Who wants to pursue something that's useless? Of course, this presupposes that the psyche, the character, the soul are in and of themselves useless, which is a very major problem, I think, to anyone who believes in liberal arts education. I think universities often contribute to this misunderstanding by stressing the financial advantages and playing down the classical, literary, philosophical, theological, and artistic dimensions of liberal arts. They play them down in favor of the practical. Again, I'm not against the practical, nor am I saying everybody should go to a liberal arts college. And obviously, by liberal arts, I'm including the sciences. By no means is that my point. But if you do have a liberal arts college, or you are actually going to a real university, then in fact, I think there needs to be attention to how this differs from a vocational school. And one of the sad things to me is it's quite possible to do both. I know people who have gone to college and majored in some literary, philosophical, religious field, and then immediately afterwards gone into medical school, law school. You know, you don't necessarily have to continue with what you major in, but it's very important to have that exploration that I mentioned earlier as a central goal of why you're in college at all, if it's in the liberal arts model, not the vocational or technical model.
Well, and of course, there's no contradiction between getting a liberal arts undergraduate education and then going off and using it in the professions. That would seem to me to confirm the usefulness of a liberal arts education.
Yes, I think it is useful, but I also think it's of value even if it isn't useful, even when it doesn't contribute to your earning potential or to how well you do your job in some sort of office or whatever afterwards. I think that there are things that are useful in and of themselves, and useful in and of themselves in the sense that they promote the well-being of the mind and the well-being of the person, and they need to be pursued for their own sake, alongside all the more practical considerations that everybody understands.
Right. The word useful is dangerously ambiguous. It can mean useful for the cultivation of the soul, or it can mean I can make a buck off it. And we have to be
Right.
clear about what we mean.
And the usefulness for the cultivation of the soul, that is not the uppermost concern in most universities today.
Right. Well, and when the value of a diploma is stressed in an economic way without being connected to anything that involves cultivation of the soul, that helps create an environment where students get the impression it doesn't really matter what they study, what they believe. They're here to get a piece of paper that an employer will value. And that probably feeds into some of the other dysfunctions we were talking about earlier.
That's right. Credentialing, the notion you're there to get that piece of paper, to have the check mark that you did this or you did that. This is a major problem with education. It shouldn't be reduced to vocational school. It shouldn't be reduced to political activism, and it shouldn't be reduced to simply getting a credential that enables you to move on to the next step.
Well, we've looked in a few dark corners here, John, so I want to end on a hopeful note. What has pleasantly surprised you in your work over the last, say, 5 years?
That's a tough one. A lot of things have unpleasantly surprised me over the last 5 years. But I would have to say, in my own field of Hebrew Bible and ancient Jewish thought, theology, and literature, I've been pleasantly surprised by a steady stream of excellent graduate students, especially doctoral students, who are rigorous in their philology, but also appreciative of the larger literary shape and artistry of the text, and in some cases committed in a sophisticated and tolerant way to understanding its theology. Increasingly, I've seen among my students, including non-Jewish students, an interest in the history of traditional Jewish biblical interpretation, in midrash and medieval commentary, and an awareness of how this can help the modern biblical scholar without being reduced to the question of how it can help the modern biblical scholar. None of this substitutes for rigorous historical work in the modern mode, informed by a knowledge of the ancient Near East. The ability, though, of many of these young scholars to be able to juggle these different paradigms without absolutizing any one of them is very gratifying to me. I think more students than are willing to say so publicly have a sense that putting the central focus on identity and power relations is leaving something precious out. I don't think it's fashionable or in some circles acceptable to say that in academia today, But I keep finding a fair number of students who, in fact, think exactly that. And that makes me hopeful amidst all these negative signs for the future of the academic life.
You know, I talk to a lot of faculty and I ask them questions like, what's life-giving for you? And the answer almost always involves students. Having these bright young minds and seeing light bulbs go off, and seeing them, as you were describing, embrace better ways of exploring this material than the reductionistic options that are being shoved at them very aggressively. You know, the reality is still there under the surface of all the propaganda and ideology, and the reality is exciting and interesting and grabs hold of people.
That's right. I think a lot of them are very excited by the joy of discovery, the joy of exploration, the joy of surprise. I don't think you can be much of a scholar or much of a cultivated, literate individual if you are not open to wonder. And it's interesting to see how many students, even in this age of professionalism and politicization, are very much uh, committed to wonder and discovery.
Amen to that. Well, Jon, shalom to you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed our conversation, Greg.